All right, as promised, it's time to chop it up with Tom Luginbill. Always good to see Tommy. ESPN, Sirius XM, college football, recruiting analyst, does it all, and is right in the middle of the off season, which means when Jimbo versus Nick first drops, that means that Lane's got to get involved at some point. And then that means at some other point between now and the middle of July, when we take the show to SEC Media Days, someone else is going to say something in the SEC. Meantime, the Pac-12 is going to say very little because they never say anything, even though we wish they would say something. It's good to see you after that long-winded intro, but really that's been the story, right?
It has been, and it's good to see you too, Brad. I was actually with my dad this past weekend in Las Vegas, and we were actually having some old San Diego State discussions, and I always think of you and Lee Hamilton and the whole crew back then growing up. You know, listen, ever since the one-time transfer rule, the extra year of eligibility, and now, of course, name, image, and likeness came into play, those three things have arguably been the single biggest, I guess you could say, transformative legislation that the NCAA has seen in the last 40 years. And they all have a significant impact that nobody really knows what the long-term effect is going to be. And so it seems like when we're actually not playing football, the day-to-day news cycle is, all right, who's being impacted by this in recruiting and is it legal? All right, who's being impacted by this in the transfer portal with the one-time transfer rule and a guy like Jordan Addison, who obviously would be a hot commodity because he puts himself out there on the market. And you're sitting there going, well, what did you think was going to happen? We've just created free agency with a one-time transfer rule. Now we've added name, image, and likeness. So you've essentially put a market value on every player that's in the transfer portal. And it's nuts. I still shake my head each and every day, whether I get in a discussion with a college coach or we're on a radio show or visiting with you, and everybody's saying, well, how did we get to this point? And I think it was inevitable. But what I don't believe is that people thought we would get to this point with virtually zero guardrails, no rules, no blueprint on how to execute it. And everybody wants to focus on the NIL, but I'm telling you, from a recruiting perspective, from a roster management perspective, the extra year of eligibility and the transfer portal are every bit as big a problem for college athletics.
I mean, it's something where a year ago at this time I was talking about there's going to be some interesting things coming along. It has started to percolate out here. I think nationally it had already been out there. And then, I'll just use Arizona State as an example. Ray Anderson says in February, the NIL thing, we're really not going to be that big of a player. And I'm like, what? and now, and now it's times 10 mock speed, hair on fire, and we don't even know where we're going to be. It's just been a year into this. Like, it is going to get down to high schools, in my opinion. Yep. The high school kids are going to get paid.
It already is.
It's already happening. And there's kids that are putting up there, I'm open for business, and they're sophomores in high school. I'm not making this stuff up.
No, and, you mentioned Ray Anderson in Arizona State. They got enough problems to worry about, aside from publicly announcing that they're not going to take part in NIL. Now, I know they've walked that back a little bit, but you want to go to the bottom of the Pac. Yeah, just a little bit. You want to go to the bottom of the Pac-12 real fast? Say you're not going to be involved in name, image, and likeness, and see how that goes over with kids that you're recruiting. So that's a mess in and of itself. I think the thing that has got everybody so up in arms, and this is what prompted the Jimbo Fisher, Nick Saban beef. And I really believe that Nick Saban could have intimated or alluded to what he wanted to say and gotten the same point across without actually naming Texas A&M. But the bottom line is, it's not just Texas A&M. It's anybody that has the funds or has the alumni base or the resources that wants to get into this space and can. A&M might be an example of it, but here's the issue. So name, image, and likeness, I think we would all agree, was set up so that a player, once they are in college and has created value through production, through performance, maybe it's a social media brand that is attractive to various businesses and this and that, are going to now be eligible to be earned off of that. I got no problem with that. I mean, that if that's the path we're going down, fantastic. But this isn't NIL. This isn't even pay to play. This is pay to sign. And I think that's what gets concerning, because we already have, Brad, the haves and have-nots in college football. Well, when you start to look at the financial ramifications of all of this, we're going to be left with about 6 to 8, maybe 10 teams max that can even afford to live in this space. Everybody else is an institution and their alumni backing and their boosters. They're going to go, Well, how good of an investment is this? If we're going to sit here and say that maybe 40 to 50% of a recruiting class isn't going to pan out, we're dealing with 17-year-old kids, and we're going to put forth all of this money just so we can be involved and be a big shot, say we matter to the program. Well, what happens the moment that kid's not playing? And then what happens the moment that guy transfers? Now you're looking at the coach, and the coach is saying, hey, listen, I'm supposed to coach these kids, develop them. And if they're not playing, maybe somebody in front of them is better. And if they leave and go somewhere else, hey, listen, I can't help that. That was put forth in front of us, and we had no choice over it. So this thing's going to get a lot messier before it gets cleaner, Brad.
Okay, so in the space of the booster and the power of the booster, Tom, do you believe this will get to a point where the booster will say, you're running the wrong offense, you're not using this player correctly, this player needs to get used more? Are we going to get to that point, or am I naive to think that is not happening already, where some boosters are saying, we paid all this money, now run him more, give him the ball more, play this guy more?
I think it's probably happened at various places throughout the course of a season for probably the last 50 years, and now it's out in the open. And everybody knows what everybody's doing. There's virtually no rules for it. So now I think we could find ourselves, and I don't want to get too dramatic here and go too deep into the weeds, but are we embarking on having ourselves another Southwest Conference where this thing gets so out of hand because there are no rules that everybody just starts throwing each other under the bus, and then the whole thing blows up? And I don't think that's what anybody wants. But I do think that if you're going to put forth power, because I've had a lot of people tell me, Brad, they'll say, well, eventually the market will correct itself. Yes, that's true, but it's only true if those investing are actually people that want to stay in business.
Yeah.
Oftentimes these boosters and alums and these big money people, they've got money to lose. So they're putting forth that money because they want to be a part of something, right? They want to say they had say and that they were involved in landing this kid or bringing along that kid. And if they lose $200,000 or $600,000 or whatever, many of those people in that realm can afford to do so. And so if that happens, then you're not going to see a market correct itself. And that's why I think the only thing that will correct the market will be the players themselves, because I believe that Quinn Ewers at Texas is going to be the most fascinating experiment in all of this. Mm-hmm. This is a player that left high school because he couldn't earn NIL compensation at the high school level in Texas, supposedly gets a bunch of money to go to Ohio State from an NIL perspective, never reaches above fourth on the depth chart, goes into the open market to come back to Texas. You've got to know there's money involved in that, and has not taken one snap. What if Quinn Ewers falls flat on his face? And then you have another high-profile guy and another high-profile guy. Sooner or later, somebody with some sense in the room is going to go, what are we doing here? Like, is this a wise investment? And I got to imagine at some point around the bend, that point's going to come.
There is a quarterback here in the Valley and at the high school level, and I was told by Arizona State, we're already priced out. We're not even going to spend time to recruit him. Okay.
Yeah.
And when I hear that stuff, first of all, it's like, well, shame on you guys for taking a defeatist attitude, because the kid's just a sophomore going into his junior year.
Correct.
Shame on you if that's really how you're going to be. But to your point of, can colleges continue to compete at this level? I want to take it down to the high school end. The players trying to set the market and the parents trying to set the market for their high school freshman, sophomore, and then coaches saying, we got to get this kid over here and this kid over here and this kid over here. It's going to happen at that point, isn't it, Tom?
So I spent the month of April, Brad. I had 3 spring games that we broadcasted. And then every other weekend that I wasn't on the road for college football, I was at a camp or a combine for player evaluation purposes, whether it was an Elite 11 or an Under Armour All-America camp, what have you. And I can't tell you how many coaches that I talked to, Power 5 level coaches, that have echoed essentially the exact same sentiment. And that is the normal recruiting pitch or the initial conversation when we engage in recruiting no longer exists. The conversation with every prospect begins with, what can you do with me? And ends with, what kind of package deal do you have for us? And whether it's the parent advising, whether it's a third party person, whether it is an actual representative that they've hired, there are no more conversations about player development and the university and the program and maybe working into the NFL or academics, the social environment, any of that. Those conversations are gone. And so what happens is let's just say All right, well, let's take that prospect. And I know who you're talking about. We don't have to mention him by name. Yeah. Let's just say that he's got 30 offers from top tier programs. 15 of those offers are from top 15 programs. So now he's sitting there. He can basically go anywhere he wants. What is the natural inclination for a 17-year-old to do if he knows that all of the choices are there? So it comes down to what? The NIL package that's being offered. Yep. You do it, I do it, we'd all do it, right? And that's not what any of this was intended to be, because now what's going to happen, and this is what I'm worried about. We are already in an environment with our young people where, particularly with the coverage of recruiting, and we're all guilty of it in the media. If you cover recruiting, you've been around it. These kids are afforded and heaped so much praise upon them at such a young age, and they're led to believe that everything's going to be easy and they're this big star, and then they get to the next level and it doesn't pan out. And now they're sitting there completely unprepared for it because they don't know what's happened. They're shell-shocked. They're homesick. They can't handle the responsibility of handling their business. And now all of a sudden, it doesn't matter how talented they are, right? Well, you start throwing money into that equation and you start making it a stipulation of when and why you would choose a school, we're going to end up producing a bunch of non-competitive people. We're going to end up producing a bunch of people that are so short-sighted that all they're seeing is right in front of them, and they're not seeing anything beyond that. So, and I look at the University of Texas. You know, you heard about that collective that came out for their offensive line, and every offensive lineman's going to get what, right. $50,000, $55,000, whatever it is. How much you want to bet the University of Texas over the next few years, if that thing's enacted, signs a bunch of offensive linemen that never play there? Because what's their incentive to perform, Brad? I mean, you're handing them something for nothing. And because of collective bargaining issues, antitrust issues, and the fact that they're not employees, a lot of these NIL deals, well, really all of them, they don't include any clauses. There's no performance clauses. There's no production clauses because they're not employees. You can't put them in the contracts. So essentially, we're handing away money here and not having to ask for anything in return. And again, not the way this was intended.
I want to focus over for a few minutes on what is going on at Arizona State on the field first, and that is Emory Jones. What is it that Arizona State is getting in Emory Jones with Jaden Daniels transferring to LSU? The fans that are left out here are trying to grasp onto anything, and Emory Jones is who they're grasping onto. What do you make out of him?
Well, I actually thought Florida let the wrong guy go. I know there's a lot of hype surrounding Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson has been very, very streaky and inconsistent at times, as has Emory Jones. Emory Jones has played a lot more football. I think in the right situation, he's going to be just fine. I don't know if that was an overly healthy situation, particularly towards the end down there in Gainesville. They part ways, and I think Emory's, number one, he's a great kid. I mean, he is going to come in and he's going to be a force for the locker room. But he gives them back some of that athleticism that they had with Jaden. The hope is that you get far more consistency in terms of performance in the passing game, because I think the beef in regards to Jaden Daniels is he has that freshman year and he never got any better. Right. In fact, you can make some arguments that he regressed in many ways, and you just can't have that happen. I don't think you'll see a regression from Emory Jones. I think he'll give him athleticism. He'll make him a little bit more dynamic. I think they'll be able to do some things that they certainly wouldn't be able to do with the likes of a Paul Tyson. I don't think Paul Tyson was really an upgrade, more so than just having some bodies in the room so you can actually compete and manage the position. But it's going to be interesting because they're dealing with so many other different types of things that could impact not only them in recruiting, but the transfer portal, but ultimately, at the end of the day, everything that's happened from the beginning of last year to up until this point, it's dramatically affecting the roster. I mean, dramatically affecting the roster. I mean, in my opinion, Eric Gentry could be a potential first rounder one day. I mean, that's the type of upside that he has. And so those things are disappointing to see.
What is the view nationally of Arizona State?
That they were brazen, arrogant, and people, when I visited with coaches or the topics come up on radio platforms, people cannot believe that in this day and age of the internet and social media and camera phones and email, and in Arizona State's case, cameras within the building, which everybody has cameras in the building, how could you be so brazenly stupid? I mean, I think that's kind of the national sentiment is Herm and that staff had started to get it going, and they're getting it going. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happens and nobody's in the building. Right. And so How did you think nobody was going to talk about it? It wasn't going to be targeted. Nobody was going to see it. And I think people scratch their heads because they say, you had the thing, you had it elevating. It was moving up. Your players were getting better. You had better depth. And now because of all of that, look at where they're at just from a transfer portal perspective alone.
U of A on the other side of the street. Nobody's talked about U of A. I said the last couple of years it was the worst program in Division I football on many levels. And now I look at what Jed is doing down there and his staff is doing down there, and they've completely embraced the state of Arizona. Doesn't mean they're going to get it turned around overnight. They get Jaden DeLora. They get some very nice players. What do you make out of what's going on in Tucson?
It's interesting, too, because I would totally agree with you. I had them 2 years ago at Oregon. And I remember standing on the field and I'm looking at them, just looking at them a hook. And I'm going, this is the worst looking Division I Power 5 team I have seen all year. I mean, they didn't have the horses, right? So I think number one, they've got to really try to upgrade their body types. They got to get bigger. They've got to get more physical, particularly up front on both sides of the ball. I know that's a challenge on the West Coast, but they're one of those programs that I think, because of what the transfer portal has provided, and because you may oftentimes have people that are from within the state that decided to go somewhere else and it didn't work out, and maybe they're an upgrade for you, you have a chance to fulfill your roster and upgrade your roster sooner rather than later. So I agree. I think it's really important in the state of Arizona because you do have good football. You have good football players. Now, you may not have, 20 of them every year that are a Power 5 caliber player, but I've always felt, regardless of the state, recruiting starts from within your state, and then you work your way out from there. If you go back, and you'll remember this, the old Dick Tomey days, and they were a San Diego built football team. I mean, that entire roster was a couple Arizona kids and then Southern California. So I do think it's important that they get back to California and really dig deep there, because that will help them supplement their efforts in Arizona.
Yeah, it's really frustrating on the high school end just to see the number of very talented players who are not being recruited, especially by Arizona State here in the last year or so. It's just like, come on, guys. You're hearing about these guys way in advance, and they just put on an act and moved on. But it's disappointing. Before I get you out of here, Pac-12. So you have Bo Nix showing up at Oregon. You have Plummer going over to Cal. You have a quarterback at Stanford that could be a first round. I mean, you have Caleb Williams, of course. What do you make out of the quarterback play on the surface coming into 2022? Because, Tom, I'd make the argument the last few years has not been great quarterback play within this conference.
Yeah, it's been very streaky, right? I mean, just up and down. You've had injuries. It hasn't been consistent. And, I got to be honest with you. Bo Nix kind of is the definition of that. I don't know what form of Bo Nix we're going to see in the Pac-12 versus what we saw in the SEC, but what we saw in the SEC, he was what I call a yo-yo player. Up one series, down the next, up one game, down the next. And if you don't have a consistent rate of performance, then you're always, I think, going to have some inconsistency as an offensive unit. Caleb Williams, I got a chance to see him twice in person last year. Really, really talented, very gifted, an ideal fit for that offense. My concern with SC is they don't have any guys up front. And they don't have any guys up front on either side of the ball. And as good a job as they've done in the transfer portal, they've really kind of done it more so with perimeter players than they have, upgrading up front. The team that I like, and we didn't mention him as a quarterback, but Utah and Cameron Rising they got a chance to be really, really good. And I think going away from the divisions and going with the highest winning percentage, I like that. I like that approach. When you talk about the Pac-12, and we always seem to have this conversation every offseason, right? The Pac-12 and the college football playoff, Pac-12 and the college football playoff. Utah could be the team that could be a dark, because they have the components in some key spots, particularly up front, that I think can cause some real problems for other teams in that league. So the one thing that I love about that league is every single week, Brad, you have no idea what's going to happen.
No, that's true.
Every single team is capable of beating somebody else. And I say that, and I look at like what Oregon State has done. I mean, the job they've done up there is Jonathan Smith and what they've put together has been fantastic. So it's very, very competitive top to bottom. They just need somebody to be good enough to not stub their toe one week and pull it off.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Utah is it seems inequitable that USC doesn't get Oregon, but Utah does get Oregon, and Utah does get USC. And then, we don't even talk about DTR at UCLA, who I think is a hell of a good player. And then You have a
when he's
quarterback.
healthy.
Yeah, and you have a quarterback of incarnate word who's going to drop in at Washington State.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so it's really interesting this year to just see it top to bottom and say, you know, this conference with Larry Scott was a rudderless ship.
Yeah.
And now Kolovkov comes in, and you feel like they're starting to do some things. They're the first to jump in and say, we're getting rid of the divisions, which never happens for this conference. They always follow what everybody else does. So I feel like a little bullish on the direction of the conference.
Well, and I think the next step in the evolution for Kolovkov is how do we expand our national footprint through television property?
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to be the next step. That's where they have to make the next biggest leap. And I know that's not easy, and we've discussed it many times. I know here at ESPN, and I've discussed it with coaches in the Pac-12, when you're trying to play in a window that the Central and East Coast time zone are going to, number one, see and want to pay attention to. You know, it's hard to do that 10:30 kick and have the entire country paying attention. But if you can somehow kick at 3, or you can somehow kick at, 2, now you put eyeballs on your conference in a way that you haven't before. And I know they've tinkered with that the last couple of years. I know there's a lot of coaches. Herm was one of them. Hey, we want to kick off at 9 a.m. every week.
Yep.
By all means, let's do it. And so you might need a little bit more of that from some of the other coaches in the conference.
I'll let you go off that. I appreciate all your time and your insights and opinions as always. Stay well, stay safe. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad.
There's Tom Luginbill, and you can catch him, of course, on ESPN College Football, on Sirius XM, and other platforms. We're back with more after this timeout.